Dear listeners, based on the normative content built in the previous section of this lecture, this section looks at the implementation of the right to food by state governments and international institutions. The focus is to highlight differential responsibilities vis-à-vis right to food even among international organizations where the UN is more liable as compared to international financial institutions IFIs like the World Bank, which are relatively free of such obligations of right to food. States are the primary human rights duty bearers. Their obligation manifests at three levels. The obligation to respect requires the state to abstain from doing anything that violates the individual rights. The obligation to protect requires the state to take measures necessary to prevent other individuals or groups from violating the human rights. The obligation to fulfill requires the state to take the measures necessary to ensure opportunities for each person within its jurisdiction. To this, a fourth obligation can be added, the obligation to promote, which concerns more or less vaguely formulated goals which can only be achieved progressively or in the long term. States, by virtue of being party to international treaties, are the primary obligation holders of human rights, and all levels of obligation are applicable to it. It must be noted that a state party to an international treaty is under no obligation to incorporate the provisions of the state into domestic legislation unless the concerned treaty specifically mentions a determined course of legislative or other measures for the state parties. In case of the ICESCR, in accepting obligation with regard to human rights, in principle, the individual states are left with the choice of means ranging from legislative incorporation, administrative regulation, informal and ad hoc procedures, or any combination thereof. Human rights norms for food and nutrition are reasonably well agreed upon by experts. The desirable behavior of governments to achieve these norms has been a contentious issue. Consensus is missing on the precise content of a state's obligation vis-à-vis the right to food, though there seems to be some agreement on states' responsibilities to ensure people's right to food during emergency, national disaster, or man-made conflict, ascertaining state obligation to the right of every human being to be free from chronic hunger and undernourishment associated with poverty, lack of income and purchasing power, and structural causes is more controversial and problematic. In an expert consultation on the right to food organized by the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights in March 2001, it was asserted that the implementation mechanism of the right to food at the national and international levels should be guided by the General Comment 12. The General Comment 12 maintained the three levels of state obligation for the right to food to respect, protect, and fulfill. Since poverty eradication, economic growth, and equitable distribution of the benefits of growth are interrelated, therefore, the development activities of individual states must be guided by the progressive realization of the right to food and other human rights. State legislations promoting agricultural production, fair food prices, just wages, environmental protection, and social security programs like access to healthcare and education indirectly advance the fulfillment of the right to food. The prerequisites for implementing the right to food include political will, organizational and managerial capacity, and the allocation and appropriate use of adequate resources. The lack of understanding of economic, social, and cultural rights among the government officials, judiciary, and parliamentarians may lead to their inadequate recognition. Though each state party to the ICESCR is required to take measures to ensure that everybody is free from hunger, conditions differ widely between countries, and hence the appropriate ways and means of implementing the right to food vary considerably. State obligation to undertake appropriate means including the adoption of legislative measures, is subjected to maximum of its available resources in order to progressively achieve full realization of the right to food, respecting a gradual approach. In practice, most states are yet to develop national legal framework around food and nutrition security. Very few state constitutions or national legislations explicitly guarantee individuals the right to food, either due to the absence of clearly stated and binding legal obligations or political will. Though the individual's right not to starve is widely affirmed by international institutions and state actions, the precise definition of the right to food and nutrition is likely to remain country and culture specific. Apart from public censure and embarrassment, no international sanction exists against a state that fails to guarantee its citizens the right to food. Under the existing human rights legal framework, states' obligations are only limited to individuals in their territory, and states not ratifying the ICSCR may altogether escape any obligation towards the right to food. States that are not parties to the ICSCR do not treat the right to food as formally enforceable, categorically rejecting any legal obligation to adhere to it. Even those states that have ratified it construe the obligation as vague and subjected to interpretation. Increasingly, states are being obligated to share the international arena with other actors and become part of the international institutions that consequently restrict their operations. While the primary responsibility for realizing human rights rests with the state, in an increasingly globalized and integrated world, the power of nation states is often eclipsed by other actors such as more powerful states, multinational corporations, or international organizations. Hence, the need to extend the traditional boundaries of human rights to regulate the power of these other international actors becomes necessary. The obligation of global actors has been increasingly realized as the intergovernmental institutions, the United Nations system and the international financial institutions, donor communities, NGOs, agribusiness corporations and private sector bear strong and continuous responsibility to function in tandem with human rights and realize these rights by facilitating and assisting national governments to establish a dialogue on accountability. The role of the UN system agencies is of special significance in realization of the right to food. According to the General Comment 12, the food organizations FAO, WFP and IFAD, in conjunction with the World Bank, UNDP and UNICEF and regional development banks, should cooperate more effectively, building on their respective expertise in the implementation of the right to food at the national level with due respect to their individual mandates. International monitoring and supervision is important to supplement and strengthen national efforts, advise through technical assistance, organize adequate international support and assistance, remove obstacles to the realization of the right to food, create awareness of situations when state actors are detrimental to the right to food, and reacting to gross neglect of state obligation of the violations of the right to food is pertinent. In this context, the UN is expected to play a proactive role in achieving freedom from hunger and ensuring food for all. Though international organizations have very limited sanctions at their disposal against states that neglect or violate human rights, 3 international procedures have evolved by which they can examine, supervise and monitor the performance of states in relation to their obligation under the requirement of the human rights system. Reporting system, complaint system and communications about gross and systemic violations of human rights. State reporting under the ICESCR is particularly significant. Member states who are parties to the covenant record their adherence by reporting on nutritional status in their countries, indicating supporting legislations and necessary measures to implement right to food with regard to the vulnerable groups who are subjected to discrimination. The Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights monitors states' compliance with the ICESCR, clarifying their reporting obligation, monitoring their progress, hearing complaints of violations and trying to rectify abuses. However, efforts to obtain satisfactory assessment of the degree of realization of the right to food through reporting remains limited and unsatisfactory and disappointing. Despite the reporting guidelines, few states have provided sufficient and precise information to enable the committee to assess the prevailing situation in the concerned countries with respect to right to food and to identify obstacles in its realization. The state reports on the right to food have an overt emphasis on technical issues and differ considerably from one another. While difficulties in fulfilling the right to food are seldom mentioned, very few states accept the existence of hunger and malnutrition in their countries. Statistical information is hardly provided, and the practical effects of the legislative and administrative regulations are rarely highlighted. The other human rights supervisory procedure is based on complaints by individuals, groups or states. Though the supervisory body cannot initiate any procedure on its own, a complaints procedure ensures participation of the beneficiaries and contains the potential of thorough investigation of factual and legal issues related to violations of human rights. However, the complaints procedure is generally considered as being impractical for economic, social and cultural rights which cannot be progressively achieved, and as such, complaints would only relate to insufficient or inadequate implementation rather than actual violations. In the absence of procedures to accommodate individual complaints by people whose right to food has been violated, the international monitoring becomes particularly significant in establishing a dialogue with the state that can be shown to have deliberately violated these rights. Violations of the right in the ICESCR can be caused by both acts of omission and commission by states, either when states fail to ensure the satisfaction of at least the minimum essential level required to be free from hunger due to its inability or unwillingness, or through the direct action of states or other entities insufficiently regulated by the state. A state claiming its inability to carry out the obligation pertaining to the right to food due to resource constraint bears the burden of demonstrating that it has taken every effort to use all the resources at its disposal and has unsuccessfully sought to obtain international support to ensure availability and accessibility of necessary food. The ICCPR, on the other hand, ensured that any person whose rights of freedom as herein recognized are violated shall have an effective remedy. This innate discrepancy in the basic statement of obligation, which is more qualified and ambiguous in the ICCSCR, has led many to describe it as programmatic and promotional rather than descriptive and mandatory. General Comment 12 seeks to remedy this bias by envisaging access to effective judicial or other appropriate remedies at both national and international levels by the victim of violation of the right to food who are entitled to adequate reparation, which may take the form of restitution, compensation, satisfaction or guarantee of non-repetition. While national ombudsmen and human rights commissions are entrusted with addressing the violations of the right to food, the scope and effectiveness of remedial measures could be significantly enhanced by incorporating international instruments recognizing the right to food in the domestic legal order, which would then empower courts to adjudicate violations of the core content of the right to food by direct reference to obligations under the covenant. Among the food agencies, UN food agencies, the Food and Agricultural Organization FAO has a central responsibility for the realization of the promotion of the right to food. FAO is committed to ensuring humanity's freedom from hunger and raising levels of nutrition and standards of living of the people, and has subsequently declared and reaffirmed its commitment to promote the realization of the right to food through a wide range of declarations, resolutions and manifestos issued directly or emanating from conferences and meetings held under its auspices. FAO's work on agrarian reform and rural development, nutrition, women's role in food system is pertinent to human rights orientation to food. FAO's supervisory role is pivotal in assessing state parties' compliance with their obligation under the covenant to promote the right to food in their respective countries, given its specialized expertise in food and agricultural issues. FAO, by advising interested member states, is in drafting their reports on implementation of the right to food in domestic law and administrative practices, support policies and programs for achieving food and nutrition security. Through its legal office, the FAO has made efforts to sensitize the organization to a human rights perspective. As the host of the Food Insecurity and Vulnerability Information Mapping System (FIVIMS), the FAO has an opportunity to introduce human rights criteria in mapping international food insecurity and vulnerability, thereby strengthening and enriching overall human rights monitoring. At the 50th anniversary of the UDHR, the FAO published a booklet called The Right to Food in Theory and Practice in 1998, examining the rights related to food from both human rights and operational perspectives, bringing together insights from human rights experts, NGOs, UN food agencies such as World Food Programme and International Fund for Agricultural Development, and FAO's own contribution. The Intergovernmental Working Group on the Right to Food, established by the FAO Council in 2002, developed the voluntary guidelines to support the progressive realization of the right to food in the context of national food security, and was adopted by the 127th session of the FAO Council in November 2004. A right to food team, including a human rights advisor, a right to food capacity advisor, economist, and a legal officer, along with a group of project staff, was established within the FAO to mainstream the voluntary guidelines by assisting stakeholders, right holders, and duty bearers in implementation of the right to food, to raise awareness and understanding of the right at national level, to integrate the right to food into FAO's work. To further provide practical aid for the implementation of the voluntary guidelines, the Methodological Toolbox was developed, containing and series of normative, analytical and educational tools directing operational aspects of the right to food and strengthening country capacity to implement it. The Right to Food portal, the Right to Food Information and Knowledge System, was launched to raise awareness, assist in implementation through guidance, methods and instruments, and develop national and international capacity pertaining to the right to food. It is alleged, however, that the FAO, specifically charged with the responsibility of food and agrarian question, has devoted practically no attention to the vital issue of standard setting related to the right to food, nor did it undertake any detailed study to the content of the right to food and its implication for the organization itself and its member states. The record of its policies and practices reflecting oft-repeated rhetorical commitments to the right to food. Though the ICSCR spells out the functions of the specialized agencies, including the FAO, in implementing the covenant, it is doubtful whether FAO's report on the implementation of the covenant contributes very much to the capacity of the Economic and Social Council in its supervisory role to assess state parties' compliance with their covenant obligation concerning the right to food. The FAO is essentially an intergovernmental body without any specific procedure to facilitate participation of NGOs or representation from farmers, peasants, rural worker or consumer organization in its decision-making procedures. While the FAO Charter encourages it to draft conventions in its specific areas of concern, grassroots voices are seldom heard since it is under no pressure to respond to such grievances. This has led to the FAO to interpret its standard-setting role in a highly technical manner, overlooking structural issues that thwart adequate food production and distribution. The UN human rights bodies are criticized as not having performed strongly on economic, social and cultural rights. It must be noted here that the UN system is composed of the various agencies that are formally responsible to the member governments and therefore wield to their wishes. Though each of these agencies have the scope and potential to take initiatives, but challenging the principle of national sovereignty is not a common practice. Within this constraint, the following tasks can be identified for the UN system vis-à-vis food security. 1. Use of the platform of international conferences to build consensus, advocate, morally persuade and set targets. 2. Act as a forum to prepare and negotiate international treaties on food and related areas of policy. 3. Provide technical coordination and set standard for food quality, definitions and methods of measurements for undernutrition, etc. 4. Collect and disseminate information on food supply, extent of chronic hunger. 5. Coordinate actions among national and international agencies with bilateral governments and NGOs. 6th, and implement aid programs including capacity building and direct resource transfer. There is significant disconnect between the actual power of international institutions and the legal and political options to hold them accountable, particularly the international financial institutions. Except for the United Nations, other international organizations do not share the same obligation as the states since they are not party to any human rights treaties. For example, ascribing the obligation to promote and fulfill human rights to the World Bank would not be feasible since they are not mentioned in its statute and would require more proactive human rights policy operation than the World Bank has been set up to handle. However, assigning the obligation to respect human rights to the World Bank is both reasonable and plausible. The obligation to respect implies that the bank, while designing policies, would be under the obligation to be certain that the planned policy or program would not violate human rights and ensure that the present level of human rights protection is observed. Thus, no policies should restrict the enjoyment of human rights that are currently in place or result in their abuse. However, the bank would not be under the obligation to introduce policies that establish a new human rights standards or norms. While the UN agencies FAO, WFP, UNDP, UNICEF, IFAD emphasize and advocate social justice and human rights, working to promote the right to food, it is argued that the international financial institutions do not have direct human rights responsibility, including the right to food. The IFIs not only refuse to recognize a human right to food, but on the contrary, impose an economic model based on liberalization of agricultural trade, privatization of institutions and public utilities, market-assisted model of land reform, and slashing of domestic budget, which in many cases produce greater inequalities and create catastrophic consequences for the right to food. The IFIs, being powerful multilateral institutions determining economic policies in developing countries and having autonomous decision-making powers, have significant impact on human rights. Hence, greater attention should be accorded by them to factor in right to food in their lending policies, credit agreements, measures to address debt crisis and structural adjustment programs, as has been pointed out in the General Comment 12. The World Bank, IMF and WTO have legal personality under international law, and it is clear that international law is binding on them, including concerns for the right to food. The argument by the IMF and the World Bank that their articles of agreement preclude the use of political consideration in their activities, human rights interpreted as political, is not well founded. Since most of the member states of these international financial institutions have ratified at least one human rights treaty containing the right to food, they cannot hide behind the excuse of not having human rights responsibilities. Hence, the IFIs have the minimum negative obligation to respect by not harming or causing violation of the right to food through their advice, policies and practices, especially of the vulnerable groups. They have the obligation to protect by ensuring that their partners, states, private actors and transnational corporations do not violate the right to food in granting concessions and contracts and implementing common projects that can threaten people's livelihood and food security. Finally, the obligation to support the fulfillment of the right to food requires the multilateral organizations to facilitate the capacity of people to feed themselves by providing necessary assistance to all people, indigenous, minorities and vulnerable groups, and helping to ensure emergency support when they cannot feed themselves for reasons beyond their control. The international community has been partially effective in codifying international norms pertaining to the right to food. The absence of universal consensus on the causes and solution of the food problem makes it rather difficult to promote the realization of and establish effective machinery for the implementation of the right to food. Moreover, the prevalent understanding accords priority to civil and political rights and realization of human rights such as the right to food belonging to the category of economic, social and cultural right is made conditional upon the attainment of the civil and political rights. In order to give teeth to the obligations contained in the ICESCR, the right to food must be given concrete meaning and content, enabling the formulation of international standards to assess the performance of the states. Monitoring the role and performance of multilateral agencies and financial donors who have a decisive impact on agrarian and food policy can be more effective through the establishment of firmer criteria, either through the adoption of specific conventions on redistributive land reform and agrarian policies. The right to food is intimately connected with the rights of the use and ownership of land, since food is essentially produced on the land through agricultural processes. Suggestions for the operationalizing of the right to food, especially for the vulnerable sections, have highlighted the need for agrarian and land reforms and people's participation in decision making as means of empowering both the victim groups and the social action groups, working with them to identify the human practices that cause food shortages, hunger, malnutrition and starvation, and demand protection against them. A state that seeks to ensure the right to food of its people by adopting policies would most certainly face many dilemmas between the interests of the producers versus the consumers, consumption investment, short-term versus long-term, strong central state power versus people's organization, etc. Hence, in order to attack food deprivation at its root, sufficient erosion of the power of the dominant groups in favor of the majority of the poor and hungry people through internal redistribution of assets and political power is most necessary. These internal structural changes must be supplemented by changes in the present international economic order. Actualizing the right to food for the small producers and landless workers in the rural areas who constitute the major victims of food insecurity and hunger entails agrarian and land reform legislations in individual countries that aim at growth with equity and the redistribution of economic and political power. These include security of tenure, fairer sharecropping systems, protection of rural workers from exploitation, redistribution of land holdings, ceilings on the size of private holdings, adoption of laws curbing unspurious practices like unequal privatization rights and absentee ownership, creation of liberal agricultural credit system, organization of market and credit system along cooperative lines supported by adequate laws, reasonable pricing policies and minimum wage legislations. Technological choices and research priorities in agriculture, which are shaped by social and political forces, often biased in favor of large farmers and agribusiness industries at national and international level, must take complete account of their potential impact on the right to food of small producers, landless laborers and nomadic populations and ensure remunerative employment in all seasons. In addition, greater local participation in agrarian reform and rural development programs, the right of potential beneficiaries to organize themselves to contribute to the drafting of such legislation and in guaranteeing their enforcement must be recognized. The participatory approach represents a bottoms-up approach that secures the right to food as a right capable of enforcement by the people, enabling them to participate in shaping policies and obligations designed to protect themselves from the activities of public or private actors that pretend to promote development. Participatory approach enables the victim of human rights violation to gain the power to command the protection promised by the particular human right. It is argued that in the development of a human right to food, it is vital that groups of the rural poor presently confronted with hunger and malnutrition and other support and action groups working with them articulate their concerns and needs in regard to deteriorating food situation and formulate their strategies to develop and enforce a body of law to secure their right to food. In participatory approach, the development of the right to food and the measures to recognize and protect it are ongoing process and require continuing efforts to generate and fuse different kinds of knowledge and skills through interdisciplinary network connecting human rights activists, scientists, social scientists, jurists and combined efforts of grassroots workers and right to food related NGOs both at national and international levels in order to secure the essential components of the right to food and redress harmful practices. Through deliberation and interaction, people can realize their right to protect food producing and distributing systems and identify governmental practices that impair these rights. They can also identify appropriate legal measures to prevent such wrongful and deprivational practices to vindicate their right to food. Subsequently, they can demand strategies to recognize and legally protect these rights, which are country-specific. At the grassroots level, victim groups such as peasants, agrarian laborers, fishermen, etc., who depend on sources of food production and distribution and need knowledge about their rights and means of enforcing them, must unite and organize. At the national level, specialists such as scientists, social scientists, lawyers, consumers and environmentalists etc. who understand how some practices contribute to food deprivation and need knowledge about using that insight to establish and protect right to food must come together. At the international level, NGOs and agencies must be linked to and informed by national and grassroots groups. These levels can be combined to initiate periodic review to identify violations of right to food, victim groups, research institutions and actions that could be integrated into the human rights network of food-related issues and remedial measures to protect people's right to food in particular setting. Efforts of journalists and academicians can also supplement the efforts to educate people regarding their right to food and the ways of protecting it. National forums such as media, school, government bodies, courts and ombudsman type agencies and international forums such as international organizations, foreign media and international courts can be used to spread knowledge and garner support for the right to food. In conclusion, it can be asserted that it is indeed ironical that even decades after the adoption of the UDHR and the ICSCR, followed by the evolving normative content of the right to food, chronic hunger and undernutrition persists and are even growing in incidence, as evidenced in the recent food crisis. While conventional national strategies prioritized army and military preparedness over food, nutrition and human security and development goals were equated with economic growth rather than having human beings as the centerpiece of the development process. Recognition of the right to food is crucial because practically in every part of the globe, a substantial proportion of humanity is confronted with hunger and malnutrition, threatening their very survival and right to life. A rights-based approach addresses the underlying causes of poverty and human rights violations rather than merely addressing hunger and undernutrition as symptoms. The human rights approach to global food security does not perpetuate the misery research, an analysis of why people do not have food. Rather, it provides those concerned with hunger, undernutrition, poverty and development with the possibility for operationalizing a set of norms about what should be, against which the performance of states can be measured, and opens up an avenue of advocacy at national and international levels based on obligations accepted by the state and the potential for utilization of the international supervision system. The right to food provides an opportunity to address hunger as a human rights issue within the developmental discourse and the established norms of international law that progressively integrate the economic, social and cultural rights with the civil and political rights, realizing their interdependence and according them equal importance. The advocacy approach has gained increasing prominence in the context of global issues of the right to food. It is used by international institutions, primarily the UN system and the FAO, and non-governmental networks and coalitions active in food, hunger, nutrition and developmental issues to address conflict of interest between various actors like corporations, producers and consumers. Advocacy approach views food security from a particularistic perspective, identifying specific actors, agencies and their actions responsible for the conditions underlying hunger and undernutrition, and initiates definite remedial measures through mobilizing stockholders, organizing boycotts and maintaining public awareness. It also makes the agencies accountable regarding their application of human rights standards. However, since human rights violations are not isolated acts and are rooted in basic structure that reproduce them, this method suffers from the lack of micro-level research in specific contexts. Nevertheless, the advocacy approach is particularly appropriate for generating international awareness and standard setting for the right to food. It is a powerful means which, if creatively exploited by the UN system, can infuse the right to food agenda within the dynamics of food security debates and the mandates of the international food institutions to address problems of hunger and undernutrition that threaten global food security. Understanding the right to food is intricately related to the definition of food security, measurement of hunger and malnutrition, and determination of vulnerability to hunger and malnutrition, and therefore to food insecurity. Since food security is variously defined, determined and interpreted, disagreement persists on what constitutes adequate food over which everyone has a right. The amorphous definition and content of the right itself and the shifting nature of the beneficiaries leads to uncertainty regarding the obligation of the states and the international institutions in ensuring it. UN advocacy, standard setting, guidance and monitoring are critical for the human rights approach to global food security. State actions can build on international advocacy to assist in the realization of the right to food. Thank you.